I'd like to call the hearing to order. The topic of today's hearing is an overview of the renewable fuel standard, the government's perspective. As you know, this is one of those issues where we have a lot of different viewpoints on this important issue, and we have not really revisited the renewable fuel standard since it was last expanded in 2007. And so we began these hearings. I don't think we have any preconceived thoughts. We know that there are some areas of concern, and it's time for us to simply revisit and re-explore and look at this, look at the original expectations of this program. I think we'd all acknowledge that the landscape has changed significantly since the RFS was revised in 2007, and there's a long list of energy policy assumptions back then that differ significantly from the realities of 2013. Perhaps the biggest unexpected development has been the decline in gasoline usage over the last 5 years. Certainly automobiles are more efficient. We've had a slow economy, and this has led to a number of issues we will address today, including the so-called blend wall and the approval of E15. We've also learned firsthand how the RFS implementation would be affected by a drought that reduced corn yields as occurred last summer. So we have a unique opportunity of looking back on several years now of practical experience with the RFS, and it's time to ask what that experience has taught us. It is also time to project what the future might hold for the RFS as we continue to implement the stringent and increasing targets. We began this process, as many of you know, many of you participated in it, by issuing a series of bipartisan white papers on the major topics associated with the RFS, the blend wall and fuel compatibility issues, agriculture sector issues, environmental concerns, energy policy considerations, and we are set to release the final white paper that deals with implementation and enforcement issues. The wide-ranging stakeholder responses to the questions posed in these white papers attest to the fact that many people have been affected by the RFS and that we need to be mindful of all of its direct and indirect impacts. We have a distinguished panel of witnesses with us today, and I'm going to introduce them after the opening statements. And at this time, I'd like to yield as much time as he may consume the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton, for the purposes of an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In 2005, I was chairman of the committee and chairman of the conference committee that passed the Energy Policy Act, and I supported the inclusion of a renewable fuel standard in that bill. In 2007, I was the ranking member on the committee, and I strongly opposed the bill in 2007 that greatly expanded it. So I guess you could say I'm 50-50, and I've been on both sides of the issue. I don't want there to be any misunderstanding today, however. The current law as it is unworkable and unsustainable, and I support total and full repeal. I think it has outlived its usefulness. I want to quote from the first line of the Energy Information Administration's written testimony: "The RFS program is not projected to come close to achievement of the legislated target." End quote. So I welcome this hearing. I encourage the subcommittee and the full committee under the leadership of Chairman Upton to take a serious look at this, and I am hopeful that at some time this year we can move a repeal bill. And with that, I still have a minute to go, so I'm happy to yield to whoever the chairman would like for me to yield to.
Does anybody want the last 40 seconds? Okay, I yield back the balance of my time. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Rush, for a 5-minute opening statement.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing on the RFS. Over the course of the past year, my office has literally taken dozens of meetings on this critical topic, both from proponents who support the RFS as it is, as well as from the opponents who would like to see the RFS either modified or repealed altogether. Mr. Chairman, for stakeholders from my home state of Illinois, there are few energy issues as important as the matter of the RFS, and I've always been very supportive of this policy because I believe since its inception, it has achieved many of the goals that it was first enacted to do. During the debate in the Energy Policy Act of 2005, when the RFS was first established, and subsequently in the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007, when the policy was significantly modified and expanded, there was always strong bipartisan support for the RFS. Members on both sides of the aisle touted the potential benefits of enacting a renewable fuel standard, which included reducing U.S. dependence on oil, enhancing energy security, bolstering the agricultural economy, and addressing the challenges of climate change by reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector. Today, I believe the RFS has been successful in meeting each of these objectives, while also helping to drive job creation and economic investment. For instance, the RFS has played a key role in helping America's ethanol industry support 400,000 jobs nationwide, including 54,000 jobs in my state of Illinois alone. And it has resulted in over $40 billion in economic activity. Mr. Chairman, the RFS has indeed helped to make us more energy secure, with America's ethanol industry now producing 10% of the nation's vehicle fuel supply, helping to reduce our dependence on foreign oil by 25% since 2005. Additionally, the octane from ethanol will also be a key component in helping auto manufacturers meet their CAFE standards as they turn towards downsized, turbocharged engines with increased combustion rates that will need higher octane fuel such as ethanol to meet new mileage standards. Mr. Chairman, as President Obama stated yesterday, we cannot continue to overlook the fact that over the past year and a half alone, all across our nation, we have seen more frequent record-breaking temperatures and history-making extreme weather events, including severe wildfires, hurricanes, tornadoes, and flooding, events that scientists tell us are all associated with man-made climate change. So today, more than ever, it is essential to move towards an energy policy that requires an even greater reliance on renewable sources of energy and alternative fuels, as the RFS mandates, and away from carbon-intense fossil fuels that emit dangerous levels of greenhouse gases and contribute to climate change. Mr. Chairman, I'm glad that we're having this hearing today, one of several, where we can lay out all the facts, including both the opportunities and the challenges to implementing the RFS as currently drafted, and we can work to find common ground on this issue moving forward. Thank you. Now yield back to balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. This time recognize the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Upton, for a 5-minute opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is an exciting time for energy policy and for the possibilities created by our domestic energy abundance. Last week, the subcommittee held 2 hearings, one on the nation's potential for increased energy exports and the other on the benefits of affordable energy to the domestic manufacturing sector. Just a few short years ago, many would have scoffed at the suggestion that America could produce enough domestic energy to expand its exports, or that low natural gas prices would induce a manufacturing renaissance. But it's happening, and it can continue to happen if we have the right policies in place. And while we strive to make good use of the nation's coal, oil, and natural gas, we also have to allow for renewable energy to be part of that mix. But we need to make sure that it's done right. and that's why we are undertaking our deliberate review of the renewable fuel standard. The committee started the review process with a series of bipartisan white papers on RFS. Each white paper highlighted a particular subtopic and solicited input from stakeholders. And as you can imagine, the response has been overwhelming. And I thank Ranking Member Waxman and his staff for working cooperatively with us and the commenters for their participation as well. And I can assure them that their input will in fact help us inform our process. And now we move on to our first hearing, which is going to be the committee's first hearing specifically devoted to the RFS since the program was last revised in '07. The purpose of this initial hearing is essentially to perform a checkup on the RFS. What's gone according to plan and what has not. No policy is certainly perfect, especially one that is now more than 5 years old. It's time to assess the RFS in light of what we now know. Today, we commence our effort with 3 federal agencies that play a role in putting the RFS into action. Congress gave the reins of the program to EPA, and the agency's responsibilities are indeed extensive. Several of these responsibilities require input from other agencies, including the Energy Information Administration, as well as the Department of Agriculture. This hearing is going to cover a number of issues, and I'm particularly mindful of the impact of the RFS on the auto industry and on our car owners. Fuels and vehicles operate as a system, and we need to ensure that provisions in the RFS are compatible with existing vehicles as well as the new cars and trucks that are going to be manufactured and sold in the years ahead. One of the things that Congress could not have anticipated back in '07 is the very ambitious new CAFE GHG standards that are going to require a near doubling of the fuel economy by 2025. Harmonizing these rules with the requirements of the RFS is just one issue for which a constructive debate is needed. The white papers and having today's hearing have gotten the discussion off to a positive start. I look forward to working with every one of our members on this committee in the coming weeks as we continue to weigh our work and oversight towards addressing the very real issues that implementation of the RFS presents going forward. And I don't know if there are other Republican members on my side that wish the balance of my time, but seeing none, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. This time recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman, for a 5-minute opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yesterday, President Obama laid out a plan to cut carbon pollution, fight climate change, and protect the health and future of America's children. The plan sets us on a path to reduce carbon pollution by 17% by 2020, which is what we need to do in the near term. In his speech, the President talked about the moral imperative for action on climate change. As he told the college students in the audience, quote, "The question now is whether we have the courage to act before it's too late. How we answer will have a profound impact on the world that we leave behind, not just to you, but to your children and to your grandchildren," end quote. As the President's plan recognizes, there is no silver bullet. Success will require sustained action across multiple fronts. One of the most critical fronts is transportation. The transportation sector is our country's largest consumer of oil and the second largest emitter of carbon pollution. Thanks to President Obama, we already have new standards to make vehicles far more efficient and less carbon polluting. Those standards are saving Americans money at the pump, enhancing our energy security, and boosting our economy, as well as cutting carbon pollution. But as long as our transportation system relies exclusively on fossil fuels, we will continue to make climate change worse. Fuel efficiency alone will not achieve the 80% reduction in climate pollution that we need by 2050 to avoid catastrophic climate change. The shift to hybrids and electric vehicles is a big part of the solution, but low-carbon renewable fuels can also contribute significantly, and for some transportation sectors, such as aviation and shipping, low-carbon liquid fuels are the only option besides efficiency. Today we are examining a law, the Renewable Fuel Standard, or RFS, that is driving development of those new low-carbon renewable fuels. The RFS is one of the few laws adopted by Congress that explicitly and directly reduces carbon pollution. Under this law, U.S. companies last year produced 20,000 gallons of an advanced renewable fuel called cellulosic ethanol, which is made from materials such as crop residues and switchgrass. That may sound like a small volume until you understand that last year was the first time that cellulosic ethanol has ever been produced commercially in this country. The Energy Information Administration estimates that production will grow to 5 million gallons this year and reach 250 million gallons by 2015. And the RFS requires that every gallon of cellulosic ethanol reduce carbon pollution by at least 60% compared to gasoline. American companies are also producing large volumes of biodiesel, another advanced renewable fuel, which reduces carbon pollution by at least 50% compared to the diesel it replaces. The RFS is incubating an advanced renewable fuel industry that has the potential to offer tremendous climate benefits and grow our economy. But the RFS is not without flaws. As our gasoline consumption goes down and the renewable fuel mandates increase, we could reach the blend wall, where adding more ethanol to the fuel supply could damage some engines. Drop-in biofuels offers one solution, but they are still being developed. Over the last few weeks, Chairman Upton and I have released a series of white papers discussing the RFS and soliciting public comments on the law. This process has been bipartisan, and I commend the majority for working together with Democrats. Commenters highlight both benefits of the RFS and concerns, and they have a variety of recommendations for this committee, which we should consider carefully. This hearing gives us a further opportunity to take a careful look at the RFS. As we move forward, the key question we need to ask is, what will the effects be on our climate? If we consider changes to the RFS, they should preserve and strengthen the law's climate benefits. As the President stated so forcefully yesterday, quote, "Someday our children and our children's children will look at us in the eye and they'll ask us, did we do all that we could when we had the chance to deal with this problem and leave them a cleaner, safer, more stable world," end quote. I encourage all members to contemplate this question. We won't get a second chance. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Waxman. At this time, we've concluded opening statements, and today we have only one panel of witnesses. And as I had indicated earlier, we have representatives from agencies that are responsible for implementing and studying the RFS. And so I want to welcome all of you to this hearing. We do look forward to your testimony and listening to your expertise and observations. And today we have Mr. Adam Szymanski, who is Administrator of the United States Energy Information Administration. We have Mr. Christopher Grundler, who is the Director of the Office of Transportation and Air Quality at the United States Environmental Protection Agency. And we have Mr. Joseph Glauber, who is Chief Economist at the United States Department of Agriculture. So welcome. And each one of you will be recognized for 5 minutes, and as all of you have testified here before, and there are 2 boxes, and when the red light goes on, your 5 minutes is up. So, but we do look forward to your testimony, and Mr. Szymanski, I'll recognize you first for 5 minutes for your opening statement.
Chairman Whitfield, thank you. Ranking Member Rush, members of the subcommittee, thank you all for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the Renewable Fuel Standards Program. EIA, as you know, is a statistical and analytical agency within the Department of Energy, and by law, EIA's data, analysis, and forecasts are independent of approval by any other officer or employee of the U.S. government. I'd like to make 9 points in summarizing my testimony. 1, The RFS program is not projected to come close to achieving the legislated target of 36 billion gallons of renewable motor fuels by 2022. This is not a new finding. All of EIA's annual energy outlook reference case projections since the targets were enacted in 2007 have indicated that EPA would need to apply the law's flexibility to reduce requirements for cellulosic, advanced, and total biofuels. In the AEO 2010, EIA projected a shortfall of over 10 billion gallons of RFS credits relative to the target for 2022. And in our most recent AEO 2013, that shortfall is now projected to be 17 billion credits. So basically only about half of the legislated $36 billion target. Two, substantially increasing the use of biofuels can only occur in forms other than the low percentage blends of ethanol and biodiesel that account for nearly all of their current use. Of the potential alternative pathways, one, increased use of higher ethanol blends, two, the advent of drop-in biofuels, or three, the development of compatible renewable fuel components such as biobutanol. Of those, so far, none have achieved a significant market role. Three, the implicit premise that cellulosic and other advanced biofuels would be available in significant quantities at reasonable costs within 5 to 10 years following adoption of the 2007 targets has not been borne out. The AEO reference case projections do not assume breakthroughs in transformational technologies. Four, ethanol potentially has three distinct roles in motor fuels markets. One as an octane source, two as a volume enhancer, and three as a provider of energy content. So an important behavioral question arises with the use of higher percentage blends such as E15 and E85, and that is whether the shorter range provided by a tank full of fuel due to ethanol's lower energy content per gallon will affect consumers' buying decisions. In Brazil, where a high percentage of ethanol fuels are sold, consumers do indeed consider energy content pricing rather than simply buying the cheapest fuel. Five, ethanol faces some major demand and distribution system challenges that make it difficult to increase its use as a motor fuel regardless of its source. Although the use of E15 in model year 2001 and newer light-duty vehicles is now allowed, very few gasoline retailers offer it out of concerns related to automobile warranties, potential liability for misfueling, infrastructure costs, and consumer acceptance. Ethanol blends above 15% E85 are more widely available but can only be used in flex fuel vehicles, which make up only about 5% of the light-duty fleet. Sixth, projected declining trend in motor gasoline in the AEO 2013 reflects a significant change from the growth projections from 2007. Since 2007, fuel economy standards, together with slower economic growth, higher gasoline prices, and possible changes in consumer behavior have changed the outlook. But lower gasoline demand is not at the root of the past or projected shortfalls in achieving legislated RFS targets. Seven, projected reliance on oil imports in the AEO 2013 is significantly lower than in 2007, due primarily to lower projected petroleum demand growth coupled with a significantly more robust outlook for domestic petroleum production. Incremental biofuel volumes under the RFS program play only a small part in reducing projected net import dependence as a result, among other things, of the likely continuing use of ethanol as an octane enhancer, even in the absence of a renewable fuel standard. Eight, as discussed in my written testimony, the challenges facing renewable fuels program are reflected in the value of RINs, renewable identification numbers, that are used by EPA to implement the program. Nine, and finally, I want you to know that EIA remains actively engaged in monitoring and reporting on matters related to the RFS program. We collect monthly data on biodiesel and ethanol production, as well as weekly and monthly data on ethanol blending. The complexity of refined product markets, of which biofuels are an important part, has led to a growing number of requests for EIA analysis. Last fall, we published a report, Biofuels, Issues, and Trends. It's attached to my testimony to provide an overview of the dynamics of production, consumption, trade in ethanol, biodiesel, and cellulosic fuels. We also hold regular workshops to solicit feedback on a variety of these subjects. Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Szymanski, and Mr. Grundler, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Whitfield, Ranking Member Rush, and other members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to testify on the Renewable Fuels Program today. The RFS program began in 2006 under the Energy Policy Act of 2005. The statutory requirements for the RFS program were then modified by the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007, or ESA. ESA established new volume standards for renewable fuel, reaching a total of 36 billion gallons by 2022, including 21 billion gallons of advanced biofuels. The revised requirements also included new greenhouse gas emission thresholds and a number of other provisions. After extensive notice and comment process, EPA finalized regulations to implement ESA requirements, which went into effect on July 1st, 2010. ESA requires EPA to publish annual standards for total, advanced, biomass-based diesel and cellulosic renewable fuels. These standards apply to obligated parties, typically refiners and fuel importers. The statute directs EPA to determine the projected volume of cellulosic biofuel production for the following year. And if that number is less than the statutory volume, EPA must lower the standard accordingly. Congress also provided EPA the discretion to lower the advanced biofuel and total renewable mandate up to that same amount. Before proposing annual volume standards, EPA conducts a thorough review of the cellulosic industry to determine the total production capacity. We consult with the USDA, the Energy Information Administration, and the Department of Energy. We propose the annual standards through a transparent process, allowing for public review and comment. We proposed the 2013 RFS standards in February 2013, and we're proposing to maintain the statutory level for total renewable fuel of 16.55 billion gallons. We had a public hearing on this rule on March 8, 2013, and we're currently in the midst of reviewing the public comments, which were extensive, to prepare the final rule. Congress also tasked EPA with evaluating and qualifying new biofuels for use in the RFS program. We've already approved a significant list of advanced and cellulosic biofuels and pathways. We have a number of additional evaluations underway for new ones. EPA continues to expand the number of approved pathways, including the recent finalization of a rule that includes certain renewable fuels from camelina oils, ethanol from energy cane, and renewable gasoline from various feedstocks. In addition, just a few weeks ago, we proposed a rule that included additional new advanced biofuels, which included cellulosic fuels from landfill biogas and advanced biobutanol from corn. EPA is working with stakeholders to improve the implementation of this program. Compliance under the RFS program is demonstrated through the use of renewable identification numbers. These document the production and distribution of renewable fuel. Obligated parties supported the use of this approach to provide them added flexibility in meeting the RFS standards. This past February, we proposed to establish voluntary quality assurance program for verifying the validity of these RINs. This voluntary program was proposed after receiving extensive input from oil and renewable fuels industries with the goal of improving the liquidity of this marketplace and allowing renewable fuel producers to sell their RINs. Again, we're in the process of reviewing public comments on this proposal and hope to finalize it by the end of this year. Although both ethanol and non-ethanol biofuels can be used to meet the RFS, ethanol has and will likely continue to be the predominant renewable fuel in the market for the foreseeable future. As the statutory volume requirements of the RFS program increase, it becomes more likely that the volume of ethanol projected to meet those requirements will exceed the volume that can be consumed in the common blend of 10% ethanol and 90% gasoline, referred to as E10. Additional volume of ethanol would then need to be used at higher blend levels, such as E15 or E85, or significant volumes of non-ethanol would be needed to meet the targets. As a result, to the extent that ethanol is likely to be used to meet RFS volume requirements, the volume of ethanol that can be legally and practically consumed is a limiting factor in meeting the statutory volumes. This is commonly known as the blend wall. For 2013, we expect compliance with the RFS standard through the use of RINs generated in 2013, as well as carryover RINs that were generated in 2012 by overcompliance with the standards. However, in 2014, the situation could be different. First, the advanced biofuel and total renewable fuel requirements rise substantially under the law to 3.75 billion gallons and 18.15 billion gallons, respectively. While non-ethanol biofuels are anticipated to continue to grow, an estimated 16 billion gallons or more of ethanol might still be needed to comply with the 2014 statutory target. Second, the number of carryover RINs from 2013 will also be a critical factor to consider. We'll continue to look at the potential impacts of this blend wall over the near and longer term. We're currently reviewing comments submitted in response to the agency's proposed rulemaking for the 2013 RFS volume standards and are carefully considering this input. EPA will also engage with stakeholders on this issue as we move to propose the RFS volume requirements for 2014. We're continuing to work with our partners, our stakeholders, and the public to implement this program as directed by the Congress. EPA will also further evaluate and consider whether any further action under the authorities established by Congress is appropriate to help ensure an orderly implementation of this program. Thank you for this opportunity to be here today.
Thank you, Mr. Grundler, and Dr. Glauber, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Whitfield, Ranking Member Rush, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to be at today's hearing to address the question of how the Renewable Fuel Standard has affected U.S. agriculture. Corn ethanol production increased dramatically over the past decade from just over 2 billion gallons in 2002 to almost 14 billion gallons in 2011. Driven by favorable market forces and encouraged by government biofuel policies, including the RFS, that increase has spurred corn production and corn use for ethanol and has been a factor in the recent grain price boom and overall improvement in farm balance sheets, including record farm incomes over the past few years. This boom has not been shared equally by all segments of the ag sector, however. Livestock, dairy, and poultry producers have faced tighter margins due to higher feed costs. The rapid expansion of corn-based ethanol production has had significant impacts on U.S. corn production and use. From 2006 to 2011, corn use for ethanol increased by about 700 million bushels per year, rising to about 5 billion bushels. The sharp increase in the demand for corn for ethanol was a major factor behind the increase in prices over that period. From January 2000 to December 2005, the monthly average price paid to corn producers averaged $2.10 per bushel. Over the period January 2006 to December 2010, corn prices averaged $3.61 per bushel, a 72% increase. Higher prices encouraged producers to plant more corn to meet the increased demand. Corn planted acreage, which had averaged 79 million acres between 2000 and 2006, averaged over 90 million acres between 2007 and 2012. Increased plantings combined with increased yields resulted in corn production of 13.1 billion bushels in 2009, a record, an increase of 2.8 billion bushels over average production levels over the period 2000 to 2006. Despite the increase in corn production since 2006, other uses for corn have declined as more corn has been diverted to ethanol production. Corn feed and residual disappearance declined by 26% from the marketing year 2005-06 to 2011-12, while corn exports declined by 28% over the same period. The decline in corn use for feed has been partially offset by the increased availability of protein feeds such as distillers dry grains, a co-product of the dry milling process. Nearly 1/3 of a bushel of corn used for ethanol production is returned in the form of DDGs. The decline in U.S. corn exports have been offset in world markets by increased exports from foreign suppliers, principally Brazil. Over the years 2000 to 2005, the U.S. exported on average 1.9 billion bushels of corn and accounted for about 60% of total world corn exports. By 2011-12, U.S. corn exports had fallen to 1.5 billion bushels and accounted for 37% of total world exports. With drought-related reduced supplies in 2012-13, U.S. corn exports are projected to fall to 700 million bushels, less than 20% of total world exports. U.S. corn exports are projected to recover to 1.3 billion bushels in 2013-14, but they are projected to account for about 1/3 of total world exports. In general, high commodity prices over the past few years have strengthened the farm balance sheets by raising farm receipts and produced record farm incomes. Over the period from 2000 to 2006, cash receipts for the farm sector averaged $217 billion. However, over the period 2007 to 2013, cash receipts are projected to average about $339 billion, an increase of 56%. Net cash income increased from an average $68.7 billion per year over 2000 to 2006. That increased to a projected $105 billion over 2007 to 2013, an increase of 53%. Based on analysis of farm business data, net cash income for grain and oilseed producers have shown significant increases since 2006, with net cash income levels up by more than 78% for corn, wheat, and soybean producers. By contrast, livestock, dairy, and poultry producers have faced more uneven, in some cases declining returns since 2006. In general, higher feed grain prices have helped net cash income for row crop producers, but have also raised feed costs at lowered profit margins for livestock, dairy, and poultry producers. Feed costs make up about 51% of expenses for dairy, 19% for beef cattle, and 42% for hogs, and 35% for poultry farm businesses. The price-feed ratios for most species show a decline throughout most of the period since 2006. Looking forward, increases in demand for corn to produce ethanol are expected to slow due to constraints on domestic ethanol consumption, as has been mentioned previous here, the so-called blend wall. Increases in blending efficiency and nearing the 15 billion gallon cap on conventional ethanol in the RFS. And finally, due to increased supply of ethanol from other feedstocks. Those will mitigate pressures on corn prices. In addition, there are projections of potentially record corn and soybean harvests this fall, rising stock levels, and subsequent moderation of prices. This should support stronger profits in the livestock and dairy and poultry industries. The outlook over the next 10 years calls for moderate productivity growth and flat to declining real prices for agricultural commodities. However, as we've seen over the past 7 years, an unexpected shortfall due to adverse weather could precipitate higher prices. Mr. Chairman, that completes my testimony.
Well, Dr. Glauber, thank you, and thank all of you. We appreciate your testimony, and this time we'd like to ask questions of the panel, and I would recognize myself for 5 minutes to begin. Mr. Grundler, states have on 3 different occasions petitioned EPA to grant waivers from the RFS, and it's my understanding that EPA denied all of those waivers, and I would like to know, what is the criteria that you use in making a decision to grant a waiver or not?
You're correct, Mr. Chairman. We have received 2 separate requests, one in 2008 from the state of Texas, and then one again last year by a numerous number of states as well as other petitioners. The criteria in the statute are severe economic harm. So the administrator was provided the discretion by the Congress to waive the standard in the event he or she determines that implementing that standard would create severe economic harm for a state or region or the United States.
And how would you go about defining severe economic harm?
Well, as you know, Mr. Chairman, Congress typically provides the agency across numerous environmental statutes different waiver authorities to deal with unanticipated circumstances. And it's pretty typical that the administrator is given discretion to view these on a case-by-case basis and looking at the economic conditions at the time. In the case of last year's situation, where we had this devastating drought, which was creating very harmful conditions across many parts of our country, for sure, we determined that the RFS, in fact, was not having an impact. So the first question that the agency had to answer was, is the RFS causing this harm? And after extensive modeling and consultation with other parts and experts in the government, some of which are sitting right here, and something like 500 different modeled scenarios, we found that the most likely result is that the RFS was not having an impact. In other words, the RFS was not binding. And the reason for that is over the last many years, the transportation fuel system has optimized around the use of ethanol. As my colleague from the EIA has noted in his written testimony, ethanol has a strong economic value to refiners. And so what we determined was that if we had waived the standard, it would not have changed the demand for ethanol, because refiners were still demanding this to blend in their products for octane and for volume enhancement. So that's why we felt that the statutory criteria for issuing a waiver were not met, and we had to deny.
But you all did have consultations with the Department of Agriculture before the decision was made, and
absolutely, and we sought public comment. What we did was we did the analysis to determine if the RFS was binding, and then we relied on the Ag Department and the DOE Department to give us estimates in those small number of cases where it was binding, what would be the impact on food prices and energy prices.
Right. And you all had also made the decision that model years 2001 and newer, that E15 could be used, but if it was older than 2001, could not be used in those vehicles. How was that decision how did you decide that?
That was based, again, on extensive analysis and testing programs. The Department of Energy did an extensive statistically based testing program using a statistical sample of many vehicles, both newer vehicles and older vehicles.
But was it primarily based on, you were concerned about damage to engines in those older vehicles?
Again, the Congress has given us very specific guidance as to when we need to grant a waiver. And we look at whether or not a new fuel would create the situation where emission standards would be violated if this fuel was used. So that was based on not only extensive DOE test program, but also consulting with many different stakeholders and reviewing over 30 different studies in the literature with respect to the impacts of ethanol on engine systems.
Would you expect that E15 would ever be approved for these older vehicles?
No, our engineering judgment would
Okay.
suggest, and the available information would suggest that would not be a good idea.
Dr. Glauber, you touched on this in your testimony, but we have some groups come and say, boy, it's raising the prices of corn going up, it's affecting feedstocks, whatever in price, and other groups say, well, it has no impact at all. Just from your analysis, your experience, what would your view be on that?
Well, I think, it's clear that, as I said in my opening statement, that increased ethanol production has precipitated a large increase in corn production. With that, a large increase in corn demand. With that, you see increased prices. Now, a lot of other factors are out there in the world that affect prices, and there's a whole list of things that people typically talk about, but things like we had some fairly serious droughts over the period. We've had increase in foreign demand. A number of things have affected price, but most of the studies that we've looked at show that ethanol has contributed to some share of that increase. And
okay.
I think my own study showed about 30%. That's similar to a lot of other studies that have been out there. So,
thank you.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, my time's expired, but thank you for answering. And at this time, I recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Rush, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Grundler, has the RFS failed to meet the overall gallon amount of the RFS in any year so far? Is that a yes or no?
The total RFS standard has been met so far, yes.
Mr. Szymanski, in your estimation, what would happen to domestic energy prices if ethanol was removed from the vehicle fuel system?
We think that the use of ethanol would not change very much if the renewable fuel standards were eliminated because of the use by the industry of ethanol as an octane enhancer and a volume enhancer. If it's cheap enough, they're quite happy to add it to gasoline. The key thing is its use as an octane and oxygenate enhancer.
Thank you. Mr. Grundler, I'm going to come back to you again. There's been a tremendous amount of peer-reviewed research and modeling conducted to estimate the reduced greenhouse gas emissions realized with conventional biofuels, which would help show that the RFS is working. These new numbers show that some conventional biofuels are 50% less than the CO2 emissions of the 2005 base gasoline. When will EPA update their numbers on the carbon index for conventional biofuels?
Sir, right now we have no plans to update our basic methodology for doing life cycle analytical work. That's a pretty serious undertaking. But we do update our models as we get new information. But right now we have no plans to revise our basic life cycle analytical methodology.
Simply because it's a serious undertaking? Is that the reason why you would not?
Well, not only that, it's a enormous amount of work, but it also, many people have made plans based on the results that we have already promulgated, and that would be fairly disruptive for us to redo all of that work. But we are very serious about keeping up with the science and are incorporating new information as we get it through our pathway petition process and when we approve new fuels, when we do our life cycle work.
Dr. Glover, can you discuss what has happened to farm income in the U.S. since we adopted the RFS in 2005? And conversely, can you discuss what has happened with government payments to farmers?
Yes, no, thanks. It's a great point. As I mentioned in my opening statement, both cash receipts are up by over 50%, and net cash income, that is after subtracting out all the expenses and adding in the government payments, they're up about 53% or so. So a very large increase. Government payments have gone down. Understand that by 2005, for the most part, we weren't making, we have a lot of government programs under the farm legislation that pay producers when prices fall below certain legislated levels. And prices have been above those levels for most commodities since about the mid-2000 period. Now, again, not all that was due to the renewable fuel standard, but there has been, as I mentioned, a large increase in corn prices, a large increase in soybean prices and other.
Mr. Saminsky, has the RFS reduced the need for foreign oil?
I'm sorry, could you repeat?
Has the RFS reduced the need for foreign oil?
For foreign oil. The renewable fuel standard itself, where it's really having an impact at the margin is in the advanced areas, so not the corn ethanol. And that number at this point is very small, probably 300,000.
Thank you so much.
Right, so not so much.
Thank you. Mr. Grundler, how would the development of advanced and cellulosic ethanol projects be impacted if Congress were to make changes to the RFS?
I'd really hate to speculate on that matter. What Congress has told us is each year to make an estimate of what the future production year would look like. So as long as we're following that process and establishing that number based on good data and good science, I would think that the cellulosic marketplace would have a steady signal.
Gentleman's time has expired. This time, I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Grundler, you, in your written testimony, if I understood you correctly, indicated that EPA doesn't plan to do anything to revise the volumetric requirement for RFS blending this year. Is that correct?
Mr. Barton, what we've done is we've proposed a 2013 standard that reflects the statutory volumes. We're right now taking comment on that. We asked for comment specifically for an adjustment of 200 million gallons, and we're reviewing those comments right now.
Well, what happens this year if, in spite of the rosy scenario estimates, it's just not there? Is the EPA prepared to waive the fines or come back later in the year and lower the estimate, the requirement? Because in my conversations with knowledgeable experts, they indicate that this year the blend wall is going to be hit, and they're just not going to be able to meet the requirement unless they export gasoline, which seems to me kind of a silly way to meet it.
Congressman, we're quite confident in our estimate of the number of excess RINs that are in the marketplace to achieve compliance. And while we do believe that there are some refiners who are facing this blend wall, there are others who have not. And so each refiner is in a slightly different market position, but they all have different compliance options to meet their obligation. They can use these carryover RINs, they can go to the market to buy RINs, they can carry over a deficit into the next year. We really think the blend wall and what we're seeing in the RIN market is reflecting concerns about shortfall looking forward in 2014.
So for this year, the EPA policy is basically going to be cross your fingers and pray. What about next year? Is there any doubt that next year, in spite of RIN carry forward and everything else, you're not going to, it's not going to be met?
I think, sir, we noted in our proposal for 2013, which we haven't finalized yet, I want to again restate, we said that 2014 looks much more challenging, and we are seeking comment, and we've gotten a lot of comment on
You've been
from
well
many
briefed on
different
how to
people.
testify before Congress. It's much more challenging, like impossible, but I'll let that go. Mr. Szymanski, do you care to speculate on when the blend wall is finally hit, which is going to happen this year or next year, the expectation of refineries, if they're not given some relief, having to export gasoline simply because they don't have the ability to create the RINs?
Some refiners said that in addition to the possibility that they would just export to avoid the problem, there's also the possibility of simply cutting back on domestic production. EIA kind of looks at that, and our conclusion is that that's not really a viable long-term strategy for refiners in a competitive market. Another possibility would be that we end up with lower retail prices to stimulate demand for E15 and E85. How that would happen is under the RINs program. The RINs themselves would end up making it attractive for people to use more E85 and E15, but the cost of doing that or buying that down has to come from the greater gasoline pool or the E10 pool. That is one way to get around this problem, but I'm not sure that's a policy issue that Congress would have to look at to decide if that's how they wanted to proceed.
Now, if I understood you, I think in response to Mr. Rush, you indicated that if we repeal the RFS mandate, approximately the same amount of ethanol would be used to blend into gasoline because it makes economic sense for a number of reasons. Is that fair?
Roughly speaking, yes. It might be a little bit less, but correct.
Okay. Dr. Glauber, do you agree with what Mr. Szymanski just said, that absent a mandate, you'd still have approximately the same amount of ethanol consumed and put into gasoline?
I think it depends on two factors, and one is was mentioned, the octane enhancer, and I think that is a very powerful thing to continue to blend ethanol, at least in the short run. Over the longer run, there may be other potentially cheaper sources that they can move to, but the big thing will be just that basic equation of the price of corn versus the price of oil. And if corn is cheap relative to that, they'll continue to make it. Understand with the blend wall, you kind of have an upper bound, and I presume a lower bound at, the Clean Air Act reformulated gas pool, which is about $4 billion or so.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah. This time I recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Szymanski, the climate scientists tell us that to avoid dangerous climate change, the U.S. must reduce greenhouse gas emissions by at least 80% by 2050. Based on EIA's projections, is the U.S. currently on track to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 80% by 2050?
No, sir.
Okay.
We're not. We're making quite a bit of progress. The 1990 level that target was based against was about 5 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide emissions from energy-related activity. We hit about 6 billion metric tons in 2005. We're down
Clearly
now to about 5.3, but to get to that level, you'd have to be down close to 1 billion metric tons.
Clearly, we're going
our-
to need to do a lot more.
You'd have to do a whole lot more. There'd have
And
to
a
be
cleaner
policy changes.
transportation system will be part of the solution. The Renewable Fuel Standard is one policy that is designed to achieve this goal. When Congress amended the RFS in 2007, we specifically required that renewable fuel, and in particular advanced biofuels such as cellulosic biofuel and biodiesel, reduce greenhouse gases compared to gasoline. Now, Mr. Grundler, what aspects of the RFS produce climate benefits? Do advanced biofuels produce significantly less carbon pollution than gasoline?
Yes, there's no question about that. Our detailed analysis looking at both the direct and the indirect impacts of the advanced biofuels, clearly the majority of the benefits from the RFS will come from the advanced pool.
Last year, American companies produced more than 20,000 gallons of cellulosic biofuels. This is the first time that such levels were produced commercially in the United States, and both EPA and EIA expect production to grow. EPA anticipates that production will reach 14 million gallons in 2013. Earlier this year, EIA projected that we could reach 250 million gallons by 2015. Mr. Grundler and Administration Semensky, would the cellulosic biofuels industry be expected to grow this rapidly without the advanced biofuels policy in the RFS?
In my opinion, sir, there's no question that the RFS policy has produced an enormous amount of private investment in this advanced fuel sector.
And is that your view, Mr. Semensky?
It has. Factually, it's just not moving fast enough to come anywhere close to the targets that were set in 2007.
So it appears that we're at a critical juncture in this industry. Companies report that they're poised to scale up production of cellulosic biofuels dramatically, but the next few years will be important to achieve and solidify these gains. Mr. Grundler, if Congress weakened or eliminated the RFS requirements for advanced biofuels, do you think that would undermine the development and growth of this industry?
Well, of course, it would really depend on how Congress went about that. The cellulosic standard right now is a nested standard, within the total and the advanced pool. So if Congress chose to reduce both the cellulosic target and the advanced target, the logical impact of that would be considerable uncertainty and presumably financing issues for the industry.
And without an advanced biofuel industry, is it clear how to substantially reduce carbon pollution from liquid transportation fuels?
Sir, the RFS, and as written by Congress, clearly anticipated that that's where the growth would come from. These are the lowest carbon liquid fuels based on our analysis.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I commend you for undertaking this examination of the renewable fuel standard. Stakeholders have raised a number of concerns with the RFS. I'm interested in understanding these concerns and working with our colleagues to determine an appropriate course of action. However, cutting carbon pollution to address climate change must remain a priority for federal fuels policies, and the renewable fuel standard appears to be playing a key role in supporting and encouraging innovation in low-carbon advanced biofuels. I think it's important to foster this innovation even as we continue to evaluate the law. Thank you very much. Yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Scalise, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate you having this hearing. I want to thank our panelists for being here. We're starting to get a lot more questions from constituents as they recognize the impact of the renewable fuel standards, not only how it would impact refiners, how it may impact people that own older cars that are concerned about warranties being violated, but also how ultimately it will affect the price of gasoline at the pump, which is already higher than it should be, too high for many people, and getting higher. But especially when you look at the fact that a lot of the assumptions that were made in 2007, many of which were used to pass this law, well, many of those assumptions just don't exist in today's marketplace, based on, number one, technologies that we have today, but also on economic conditions. I know when some of our panelists talk about the problems that we're facing with why these numbers were so off, some of it was based on assumptions in ethanol and corn production, and we're seeing now maybe higher food prices because of that. But we also are seeing, because of both efficiencies as well as economic conditions, people are using less fuel. I mean, if somebody doesn't have a job, they're not driving to work every day. That was not anticipated back in '07, yet that's part of the economic reality we're dealing in today. And yet none of that's factored into when we look at some of the rules coming out from EPA. And so, I'm a strong supporter of repeal of the renewable fuel standard, co-sponsor legislation to do that. But I think it is important to get some of these facts out there about the marketplace we're living in today. I want to ask you, Mr. Grundler, when you were answering one of the questions that Chairman Whitfield had brought up about significant economic harm, and there's some discretion you have in coming up with that definition. Can you share with this committee the models that you used? Because we don't have that information. When y'all are running these models to determine significant economic harm, I think it'd be important for us to know what models you're actually using. Can you share with the committee that information?
I'd be happy to.
Thank you. Regarding E15 engine testing, is it, what exactly what kind of vehicles did you use? Did you just look at emission failure? Did you look at engine failure?
First of all, we looked at a number of different studies in the literature that looked at fuel effects across a variety of vehicles. The testing was actually done and managed by the Department of Energy, and they looked at a wide range of impacts. The priority, of course, was based on the statutory criteria as to what is the impact of higher ethanol blends on emission control systems, and would they lead to violating the emission standards. But they also looked at materials compatibility, about engine durability. They tore down a number of engines. Can you share with the committee
all of that information that you used in coming up with those tests?
Absolutely. All of that was all shared with the public. Appreciate and we can provide all that information to you from the waiver.
Thank you. When you were answering one of Mr. Barton's questions regarding RVOs, he was asking about the timing, and I think under the law you're supposed to, by November 30th, come up with those standards for the following year. And of course, we don't have those for 2013. And you said you're still in the development process, getting information. Of course, that creates uncertainty in the marketplace. I hope you understand that. But then looking forward to 2014, can we be assured, can you give us that assurance that by November 30th, we would have those rules available for 2014?
Yeah. The priority right now, frankly, for me, Mr. Congressman, is to get 2013 done. And we're working very hard to do that, and I hope we will get that final by this summer.
You're like about a half year late already.
Yeah, I understand that.
And so, and maybe you're overwhelmed. Maybe another argument for for repealing RFS is that you're too overloaded to do the things you're currently tasked with. All these other things that are coming down that are creating so much uncertainty, and with waivers. I mean, I think, Mr. Szymanski, you've touched on some of these waivers, and I think in your testimony you talked about the importance of EPA exercising that waiver ability, because just the marketplace isn't going to be ready for what's coming. I don't know if you want to expand on what you talked about in your testimony regarding that.
In terms of your commentary, I would say that the shifts in demand that we've seen have played a part in the blend wall problem. That the biggest problem post 2014 has been in the slow development of the advanced technology, and that's what's leading to the issues associated with meeting the high targets that were set in 2007.
All right, well, appreciate that. Look forward to hearing more testimony, and I yield back the balance of my time.
This time, recognize the gentleman, Mr. McNerney from California, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Former Chairman Barton's opening statement indicated the good intentions that went into the 2005 law and how the changing technology and market conditions present significant challenges to the RFS. However, one thing to me is quite clear. The RFS has spurred innovation. And given the threat of climate change, innovation is going to be a critical factor in moving forward. So my first question is to Mr. Gunler from the EPA. Does the agency have the necessary technical advances? Do you see the necessary technical advances emerging to meet the projected targets?
Every year as we go through this annual process, particularly with respect to the cellulosic target, we meet with the producers. So we get detailed information about where they are in scaling up their technology and from the laboratory to a commercial scale facility. That takes that's not an easy task, and obviously if you look at the historical record, it has taken longer than the Congress expected. But when we go through this process every year, we get up-to-date information on where they are, on new ideas. We get new petitions every year for new pathways and new processes and new technologies. So it's clear to me that there is a lot of innovation, there's a lot of invention that's going on, and the reality is that this takes time to scale up to commercial production levels.
Good. Well, as the EIA mentioned, we're not on a path to meet the RSF targets by 2022. Do you feel that your agency has sufficient flexibility under current law to meet the challenges of the changing technology and marketplace?
Yes, the Congress gave us a number of different kinds of authorities to adjust these standards, as well as actually the non-discretionary duty, if we do adjust the standard, as we have now with cellulosic, to reset the statutory volumes beginning in calendar year 2016. We're not ready to undertake that work. We're focusing more on 2013 and 2014, but the Congress did provide the agency with a number of tools for an orderly implementation of these standards.
So you could say we don't really need to repeal the law. You have sufficient flexibility if you're given the resources to meet the changing marketplace.
Well, I'm not here today to give you a recommendation
Right.
on legislation, but I
That was more of a
can tell you that
statement than a question.
we're focused
Thank you.
on using as much common sense as we can muster to address the facts and address the reality, and we're doing a lot of listening. We're getting a lot of different advice from different stakeholders on how to use those authorities, and we're contemplating all these issues right now.
Thank you. Mr. Glauber, what steps is the USDA taking in helping producers throughout the country develop the feedstocks necessary to meet the future biofuel demands?
Well, I think there's no question, as far as corn is concerned, there hasn't been an issue. The farmers have increased production. We're currently producing enough corn certainly to meet the demands for corn use for ethanol. Insofar as advanced biofuels are concerned, and I think that's been some of the discussion here about the underlying economics of that, we have USDA, in association with other departments like Department of Energy, have put forward development of, say, drop-in fuels. We have a program right now with the Navy for that. We've been talking to FAA about looking at potential for drop-in fuels for airplanes. We've helped develop crop insurance products for things like for some biodiesel feedstocks and things like that. So we're limited in terms of programs we have for these, but we've been trying to orient research and other things toward development of advanced biofuels.
Okay, well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. This time recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Hall, for 5 minutes.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you for this very important hearing today. The renewable fuel standard has been successful at bringing biofuels into the transportation fuel supply here in the U.S., but the approaching, quote, blend wall, unquote, raises a lot of unanswered questions, and we need to be careful and thoughtful about how we go forward and how we manage the renewable fuel standards. Mr. Szymanski, can you give us an overview of the changed energy landscape today compared to 2007, and particularly speak of gasoline demand and future projections and their effect?
Yeah, certainly, Mr. Hall. As I discussed in my testimony, the outlook for gasoline demand is a lot lower, while projected domestic oil production is significantly higher. Lower gasoline demand projections reflect higher vehicle efficiency standards, slower economic growth, higher gasoline prices. Production is primarily reflecting the role of tight oil in places like the Eagle Ford in Texas and the Bakken in North Dakota. That was not really foreseen in 2007, or if it was at the far end of the optimistic range. Together, those changes have resulted in a significantly reduced projection for net dependence on imported oil. So that's the biggest impact of the demand and supply shifts since 2007 is the impact on imported oil has been dramatic.
And what's brought about that dramatic situation? With regard to the Arabs that we relied on, I think at one time in the last 4 or 5 years, maybe the last 2 years, for 50 or 55% of our energy.
Right, it was
and
even
it's down to what? Down to about what percent is that reliance?
It was
now?
60% in 2005 and 2012,
Maybe
2011
10
we got
years
to
ago,
about 40%, and right now it's just a little over 30%. So a lot of progress has been made in doing that. That's net dependence on imported oil.
Do you think we're nearing the E10 blend wall?
Well, but it's going to be very difficult to, given the constraints on vehicle warranties and infrastructure issues, and just in terms of how you can sell an above 10% ethanol mix at the pump, it's going to be very difficult. So yes, I think that's an issue. The way around that is you have to sell more E15 and E85, and the problem there is only about 5% of the vehicles are capable of using E85, and less than 2% of the gasoline stations have the ability to sell it.
Either of you other two gentlemen have any improvement on that answer or criticism of it?
I would just say I agree. I think that's the key thing is penetration of higher blends. You just don't have the pumps, and at least currently those higher blends are not being priced competitively enough on an energy basis with gasoline.
And Mr. Scalise asked you about any doubts you had about the approval of E15 in the face of overwhelming skepticism from the automobile makers. I didn't really get your answer to them. Can you describe the test that EPA and DOE undertook before approving E15? And did you take into consideration things like engine durability or fuel pumps or anything like that?
The testing really was very extensive.
Was very what?
Extensive. DOE tested a lot of vehicles and ran a lot of miles, out to 120,000 miles, to test the impact on or the full useful life of this vehicle. They tore down engines to look at engine wear. They looked at components. So the answer to your question is yes. I don't have any doubts that we made that decision given the best information that we had at the time.
And I didn't fully understand your answer to why you didn't grant the waiver that we sought. I wrote you a letter back in 12, and in response, Texas and other states talking about relief of the drought, and Mr. Barton got into that a little bit. And I understood you to say, well, your answer wouldn't have made any difference anyway. It wouldn't have changed anything. Isn't it a fact that the reason we requested that relief was the 2012 drought that reduced corn yields and temporarily increased corn prices?
There's no doubt that the drought had those effects. The question in front of the agency under the law is, could we make a determination that implementing the RFS would create severe economic harm to the state of Texas or other parts of the United States, and we could not make that determination.
Well, how you made that determination, I'd like to get into that sometime when we have a lot more time, but I don't have much respect for the good data and the good science that you say EPA's handled up to this time. but I think I'm nearing the end of my.
Gentlemen.
I'll yield back my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. At this time, recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Tonko, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Grundler, the EPA has proposed to maintain the RFS volume standard for 2013. In light of current conditions and EIA's projections, many would ask why. I would think the current conditions of the market would lead EPA to use the flexibility under the law and adjust the required volume somewhat. Your opinion on all of that?
You're right that we did propose not to adjust the volumes in 2013, although we did request comment on making an adjustment, and we're taking those comments right now. But in the proposal, and we laid out an explanation why, we do think that there is not going to be a difficulty in 2013 to comply because of the large amount of excess credits that are available to meet the refiner's obligation. But we're quite clear that with respect to 2014, and again based on EIA's estimates as well, that the challenge becomes much greater because the statutory volumes increase substantially. And then we've asked for the public to give us some comments and some advice on whether or not we should consider adjustments going forward, how to use our authorities to do so. And we're looking at those comments very carefully right now.
Okay, and when will you provide any sort of assessment of that?
We intend to finalize the 2013 standard very soon, before the summer is over, and my goal is to propose a 2014 standard shortly thereafter.
Okay, thank you. And what does USDA predict would happen to corn acreage if we were to reduce the target volumes for RFS?
Well, first, I think it's instructive to know what we're projecting if we maintain the standards, and that is for corn area to fall a little bit just because of productivity and corn yields. We're currently, this year, we'll have numbers out on Friday, but in the mid-90 range for corn acreage. We anticipate that to fall to closer to 90, 91 million acres over the next 10 years just because of improvements in yields, and so more production off the current area. If the RFS were to be removed, then the real question is, obviously, does one continue to make ethanol out of corn? And I think that we tried to address that in the earlier question, and that a lot will depend on the price of corn relative to oil. Right now, given the projections, it is assumed that the producers would still, or that ethanol producers would still have incentives to make ethanol, but understand that that is very sensitive now, absent mandates. It would be very sensitive to price disruptions. So higher corn prices, for example, you could expect some a reduction. And if indeed over the longer period that were to cause a significantly lower area of ethanol from corn being produced, then you would expect that to have some impact on corn area.
And if you repealed the RFS?
I'm sorry, that was the scenario I was discussing.
Okay, I just wanted to make certain that's what we were addressing. And the EPA, and for any of our witnesses here, EPA has proposed designating biobutanol derived from corn as an advanced biofuel. This does not move us away from using a food crop for fuel, and I'm not certain this would help with food and feed prices. What benefit would this have, if any, in addressing some of the other problems with the current RFS program, anything from infrastructure to the blend wall and beyond?
Yeah, it would help. Well, first of all, we estimate that it does qualify for as an advanced biofuel, so it would provide greenhouse gas reductions, and it would provide an easier way to move this fuel into the transportation system.
In some conversations that I've had with individuals concerned about some smaller engines, those in boats or motorcycles and other specialty vehicles, they've had trouble running on even blends with 10% ethanol. Are fuels with lower ethanol blends becoming more scarce, and are they higher priced? And what has the info feed your way been on some of these smaller specialty engines?
Yeah. My understanding is practically the entire fuel supply now is at a 10% blend. Marinas often will provide E0 for their customers who may have older boat engines who weren't designed for the 10% blend, but 10% blends have been around for 30 years or so. So all the modern boat engines are designed to operate well on E10.
And is that true too with the motorcycle engines?
Yes.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
This time I recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Too many questions, too little time. It's great to have you all here. Let me start with just a couple statements in response. Mr. Szymanski, I would say that no one wants to be a prognosticator, especially after the fact. I don't want to do it in sports. I don't want to do it in politics. But just for the record, in 2011, you said there'd be 2.79 billion gallons of ethanol, and production actually was 13.93 billion gallons. So projections are great. They are projections. They're not. We shouldn't take those to the bank as what will happen as things will change. I also have to respond to Mr. Waxman. I'm glad the president talked to college students. I'd rather he come talk to my coal miners who won't be able to afford to send their kid to college because of what his announcement did yesterday. So I think you have to pick your audience, and I think the president did. He just didn't pick the audience that are in my district. And so as many people in this room know that I have more desire to get this fixed than anybody. I have 2 refineries in my district. I've got the largest corn producing district. I've got the biggest tight play of oil now because of the fracking in my district. I've got coal mines. I've got, I have got power generating plants. So we're working hard to go through this dilemma and walk away standing up, which I think we're going to be able to do. So let me go to a question. No one's mentioned, Mr. Grundler really, because this really is part about the requirements by law, no one's mentioned so far biodiesel, and no one's mentioned the fact that actually it's exceeded its blending capabilities, so it actually is helpful in this. Is that correct?
That is correct. The country has
and there's no blending debate, there's no fueling debate, there's no engine debate, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
not at current blends.
So
No.
that's kind of a success story. That's
Yes.
kind of getting lost. There is some success in this debate. And as I think was said earlier, if you're a climate person, there's reduction in the carbon emissions on that.
That's true.
So there is, biodiesel is part of this success story that we just, we have to keep in part of this debate. I also want to talk about the greenhouse gas threshold a little bit. We export corn-based ethanol, is that correct, overseas?
That's correct.
We import cane-based advanced biofuels, correct?
That's correct.
Do we calculate the transportation costs of these two ethanol products that are in essence no different in a greenhouse gas calculation?
Yes, we do.
You do. I'd like to see that.
Okay.
I would argue that maybe, well, I'd like to see how you calculate that, but I would argue that that doesn't make a lot of sense if you want to reduce greenhouse gases and we're sending ethanol outside and importing ethanol in, and that's not a net increase versus a status quo or a decrease. Let me go on to
clarify my answer, sir?
Go ahead.
So when we do the life cycle determination as to whether or not sugarcane ethanol qualifies as an advanced fuel, we take into account the transportation emissions from Brazil to the United States.
But not the refilling of sending of an equal amount of ethanol, corn-based, overseas to another country.
Correct.
And that's maybe...
but it's not an equal amount. It's not the trade relationship is not a direct one-for-one.
Let me go, what do you attribute, going back to Mr. Grundler again, this 2013 and not having the standards is a major problem. Because you can't expect refineries to meet goals and objectives if we don't have that. Now, I applaud your most recent response on that shortly following 2014 numbers will be approved, because that could ease a lot of our stress and strain based upon the fact that you all have to set the blending you set the standards.
Correct.
And my colleagues are right. We're 6 months into a year. We don't know what the 2013 standards are. That's why people are crazy out there. So I would say move rapidly on 2013 and quickly follow 2014. That could help ease a lot of pressure here. And I know my time's almost expired. What do you attribute the increase in the RIN prices that occurred earlier this year to?
Most observers, EPA included, believe that the market is reflecting the coming situation in 14 and 15 as these statutory volumes go up, and they're anticipating a scarcity of RINs or a higher cost in terms of moving higher blends of ethanol.
So there's a risk and uncertainty premium based upon the unknown.
That's right.
Which is why giving some data might be helpful to ease that risk. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
This time I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a habit of following my colleague from Illinois, I guess. Director Grundler, some have advocated E85 and E15s as solutions to the E10 blend wall. What do you see as the major barriers of these fuels as solution to the E10 blend wall?
There are significant infrastructure barriers at the moment, as has been referenced in some of my colleagues' testimony. There are only roughly 3,000 E85 stations at the moment selling E85, and roughly 11.5 million vehicles that are capable of using it. And that's a significant challenge to moving more volumes of E85. With respect to E15, there are very few stations today that are offering that product.
I heard that there are only a few stations, as you said, selling E15 in our country, and while E85 may be popular in the Midwest, it's not in most regions. I understand there was only one E85 station. I think in the Houston area, I think I found the one, so it's not very widely spread, except in the Midwest.
My understanding is that we have roughly 3,000 retail stations that are selling versus over 150,000 stations that sell gasoline.
Okay. Do you believe the EPA has the tools available to relieve the pressure on the blend wall in the short term? And if so, will EPA exercise this authority in the coming months?
Sir, clearly the Congress provided us with a number of tools to adjust these standards, and right now we're in the midst of getting a lot of advice. We're doing a lot of listening. We're focusing on this very, very carefully, and I'm just not in a position today to forecast where we're going to come out in 13 and 14.
Okay. On Monday, the EPA won a victory with the Supreme Court declined to hear 3 separate lawsuits on E15. It seems, however, that the consumer will actually lose, though. Automakers with limited exemptions are warning consumers that their automobiles will not be warranted for E15. How do you not have doubts about the approval of E15 in the face of skepticism by our automakers?
Sir, that's a very good question. I guess the way I'd answer it is that we did do an enormous amount of listening. We did an enormous amount of testing. DOE did a lot of testing. We looked at all the data that was available, and it simply did not show that there was going to be an impact on emission control systems by E15. Now, we're not mandating the use of it, sir. We're not advocates for E15. We're not opponents of E15. We simply made a determination under the law that it met the waiver criteria, and it will be up to the marketplace as to whether or not people will be offering that to their customers. As to the warranties, again, I would have to defer to the automakers why they make those sorts of decisions.
Well, I guess just alcohol and oil sometimes just doesn't mix. I understand EPA and DOE has for years used the Coordinating Research Council to conduct vehicle emission studies and research projects like the national surveys of E85 fuel quality, the Advanced Collaborative Vehicle Emission Study, and the Non-Road Vehicle Emission Study. Can you explain why you think the Coordinating Research Council research is valuable in these instances, but discounts their E15 test results when it appeared that EPA and DOE played significant roles directly through the National Renewable Energy Lab and CRC's mid-level ethanol blends research program?
You're correct, sir. We've got a long history of working with the CRC and cooperating on a whole variety of test programs. And frankly, we regret that we weren't given the kind of role that we ordinarily have in their latest work on E15. We were unable to, even though we asked, to be much more involved in selecting the vehicles and selecting the criteria, and regretfully, we were not allowed to do that. But we look forward to continuing our historical relationship with the CRC in the future. DOE has also commented pretty extensively on the shortcomings of the latest E15 work that you're referring to, including that it hadn't been peer reviewed, that the criteria that they chose as a failure criteria seemed arbitrary, that there were no control vehicles chosen, and so on. And I'd be happy to provide to you their review of the scientific shortcomings.
Be glad to see it. Appreciate it. Minister Szymanski, your 2013 Annual Energy Outlook early release presented a much dimmer picture for the growth of E85 sales compared with last year. Can you discuss the reasons why these projections are so much lower?
Well, the basic reason is that the projects that were underway to produce cellulosic and advanced biofuels just simply haven't materialized in the time frame that we believed that they would. As a consequence, our projections for how much of these fuels can be produced just keep slipping. As Mr. Grundler said earlier, at the end of last year, we thought there would be 9.6 billion gallons of these fuels, and we're now down to 4 to 5, million gallons. And these are, we only have 2 plants that are in the running at this point. One of them is up and operating. At one point, it appeared that there were as many as 10 or 12 plants to produce these fuels. And so the inability of the technology to advance as quickly as was expected in the years between 2007 and 2012 is the main factor.
Well, obviously, it could cause a substantial volatility in the market if the technology is not there that we thought would be there, and so that may be why we're having this hearing today, I hope. Mr. Grundle, can you please describe the misfueling mitigation measures EPA has in place and why EPA believes they're adequate?
I'd be happy to, Congressman. We required anyone who wishes to market E15 to submit to us a misfueling mitigation plan. That plan includes labeling the E15 pumps with warning labels to make sure that customers don't improperly use the fuel in vehicles that can't tolerate it or small engines. We require a survey and tracking and reporting so that we know that E15 is being tracked carefully and is being used properly, and a number of other details in the mitigation plan. I'd be happy to get you the...
Okay, if you could get that. The last question is, why does EPA believe that 14 million gallons of cellulosic biofuels is appropriate for 2013? How much is produced so far during the first 5 months, 6 months?
8,332 RINs. I want to clarify that when we came out with the proposal, that was our best estimate at the time. We are now updating that estimate based on the latest information from both producers, and we're consulting with our colleagues at EIA, and the final number will be based on that most recent information.
I recognize at this point.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your courtesies.
The gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Terry, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. And I'm not in the same position as Mr. Shimkus. We only have corn. We don't have quite the diversity of resources in Nebraska as Illinois. But I want to focus on the waiver because I'm just not grasping the full extent of the waiver. When the RFS was written, it included provisions for the administrator to issue waivers if the requirements of the program would impose economic harm or impose harm on the economy. And I'm very interested in better understanding to what extent can the agency use this waiver authority. And do you agree that there is a waiver authority?
Indeed, sir, and there's more than one. If we determine, as we have for the last 3 years, that there's not the cellulosic volume to meet the congressional standard, we adjust it, and we can also, we've chosen not to in the past, but we could also adjust the total and the advanced volume by that same amount. In the past, we've chosen not to because we determined that there was sufficient other advanced fuel to meet that target. The other waiver authority which you referenced is a general waiver authority, where if the administrator can either be petitioned by a party or can on her own determine that the RFS implementation would create a severe economic harm to a region or a state. And that the previous conversation, we've been petitioned a couple times and determined that, again, because of market dynamics and the demand that the refining industry has for ethanol, that the statutory test simply was not met, and we were not allowed to grant that waiver.
All right. Then, again, helping me grasp this. So because cellulosic hasn't really got out of the pilot to mass production yet, you were able to just waive that portion that was designated for the cellulosic growth?
That's correct.
So
We adjusted the volume down something like 98, 99% based on our estimate about what that volume would be in the forthcoming year.
So then the amount that could be done, normal ethanol, corn-based ethanol, you increase, though, still increase the volume or number of gallons from 2011 to 2012, and are you looking to do that again in 2013? I realize you haven't finalized that, but you've said you're working on it diligently.
Yeah, the proposal would have us adopt the statutory volumes for total and advanced, and then we're proposing to waive the cellulosic portion of the standard, but not we're not
just the
adjusting
cellulosic, but there's still advanced fuels that are on top of the regular ethanol.
Would the gentleman yield on just
I'll
quickly? But you reduced the 1 point of the advance, but you didn't reduce the overall level commensurate with the loss of production. Is that true?
That's correct.
And I think that's a problem.
Part of the confusion here, I think, as well. So you do the estimates on the 2013 crop and how much advanced. What's your any early thoughts of how much cellulosic is going to be on the market this year?
Yeah, our initial estimate that was in the proposal was 14 million gallons, and we're now updating that based on the comments we received.
That's the totality.
That's correct. And if I could just respond to Congressman Shimkus, the reason we didn't make the coincident adjustment in the advanced is because we determined that there are many other fuels, including biodiesel, that can make up that advanced pool, as well as, again, other advanced, domestic advanced ethanol, as well as projected imports from Brazil.
All right. I have one. You mentioned with E15 or greater, there's infrastructure problems. Could you state, maybe at the gas station level, what the specific problems would be?
With respect to E15, again, based on all the people that we've been talking to and listening to, we understand that there are both market barriers for the widespread adoption of E15, as well as remaining regulatory barriers. There are numerous kind of state and local requirements that would need to be met to sell E15. Many states still have a cap of E10 for sales in their states. There are underground storage tank and dispenser requirements that need to be met. So these all contribute to barriers to more E15 sales. My own opinion is that these liability concerns are the predominant challenge at the moment.
Yeah.
Gentleman's time's expired. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Doyle, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the panelists. Dr. Grunler, I see the President's Council of Economic Advisors is warning us that increasing production of food-based fuels such as ethanol not only increases the demand for agricultural feedstocks, but may also make demand less elastic through such measures as biofuel blending requirements. And as such, the integration of food and energy markets, can cause shocks in one market that get transmitted to the other. We've seen The expansion of corn ethanol increased corn prices by 36% from 2000 to 2009. CBO estimated that the use of ethanol for fuel accounted for about a 28 to 47% increase in the price of corn and a 10 to 15% increase in food prices. And it's important to note that these increases occurred during a time when the U.S. harvested a record 13.1 billion bushels of corn. Grocery bills have been rising 3 to 4% every year, and they will rise by that same margin in 2013. In 2011, retail food costs rose 3.7%, according to the USDA. After increasing corn ethanol mandate in 2007, the consumer price index for meat, poultry, fish, and eggs accelerated by 79%. The doubling of the ethanol mandate in 2007 caused a 30% increase in the price of corn from 2006 to 2010, according to economists. And the USDA is warning us that corn shortages, caused in part by the ethanol mandate, will drive up U.S. food prices by another 3 to 4% in 2013. In light of your comments and your written testimony on the E10 blend wall, what tools does the EPA have to ensure that higher blends of ethanol into gasoline will be filled by cellulosic and advanced biofuels as we're moving from E10 to E15? What can you do to make sure that that space is not entirely filled by corn ethanol that can negatively affect food prices, feed prices for farmers and food prices for consumers?
Well, as we've been discussing, the agency has a number of tools, including its responsibilities on an annual basis to set these different standards, these four different standards. With respect to what will ultimately be the mix of these different fuels is really something that is going to be a market choice. We will be establishing, again, our best estimate of what the cellulosic volume will be. And with respect to the total and advanced, we'll also be setting those targets. But how that gets sorted out in the marketplace in terms of the mix will be left to the market.
Mm-hmm. And also understand in your testimony, you said that EPA is recently proposing to broaden the specific fuels that will qualify under the RSF program. Can you tell me a little bit more about that proposal and what you're doing to make this program as flexible as possible?
Thank you. Yes, we have been very, very busy evaluating these different feedstock and pathway petitions that people submit to us and doing the necessary life cycle analysis to determine what their overall emissions would be and whether or not they qualify for these advanced categories. The reason this is important work and why it's important that we continue to find ways to streamline this process and make decisions faster is because this gives the marketplace many different options and choices in terms of complying with their obligations, as well as has been discussed, fostering innovation and invention and lower cost ways to meet the standard as well as provide the greenhouse gas benefits. So we have, and I'd be happy to give you the details of this, approved quite a number of advanced pathways that are sourced domestically from these different feedstocks and using these advanced technologies that will provide these benefits.
Good. I'll look forward to that detail. Mr. Chairman, that's all I have.
Thank you. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Latta, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it. And thank you very much for our panel. And if I could ask Mr. Grunler, thanks very much for your testimony today. And one of the things I've been hearing over in the last year really deals with the renewable identification number, RINs, and a company was out there and some others that were selling fake RINs for the fuel credits. And how was it, for one thing, that these companies were doing that and they weren't caught, and that took so long?
Well, sadly, in addition to all the innovation that the RFS policy has inspired in terms of new technology, it has also inspired a lot of innovation in the criminal mind, and we have discovered what can only be called as counterfeiters. And we discovered this through our enforcement arm at the agency, through hotlines and tip lines And as I hope you can appreciate, it takes a while to build a criminal case and to gather the evidence to make a prosecution. But the good news is that the United States achieved several convictions already with extended jail time, prison time for these counterfeiters, as well as very high fines, and confiscated private jets and luxury automobiles in the process. So I think that's a good result. The bad result, which you're no doubt alluding to, is this did create a chill in the marketplace because of concern about the validity of RINs that obligated parties were buying.
Could I just ask, and you're probably about ready to answer that, but what steps have the agency taken to prevent this from happening in the future?
I was just about to get to that.
Yep.
We've again did a lot of listening. We worked with the oil industry and the producers and third-party validators and proposed earlier this year a voluntary quality assurance program that would provide for an affirmative defense. So if you're an obligated party and you utilize one of these quality assurance programs in purchasing these RINs and they later turn out to be fraudulent, the government is going to hold you harmless from penalizing you for that purchase. This is out for public comment. We've got a number of different options we've proposed, and we're going through those comments right now, and we'll be finalizing this at the end of the year. But I think it has been successful, sir, in opening up this RIN market, and the evidence there is we've got more biodiesel producers this year than we did last year. And that was our concern, was that these small producers would be frozen out of the market because people would only buy from large producers that they know that have deep pockets.
Well, let me ask this, okay? You see, you have an affirmative defense out there. Some of the information I've had, maybe this is the affirmative defense is since that time. Is there still a buyer beware along with that affirmative defense?
Yes.
Okay, may I ask this then? Is there, the agency then says, is there a due diligence that has to be exercised by that buyer of that RIN?
Yeah, we do expect some due diligence, but again, if they do that due diligence, if that RIN has been through this quality assurance program, then the affirmative defense would apply.
Could I just ask, what's your definition of due diligence then that a company would have to exercise?
Can I get back to you on the record on that? This is a legal question that I'd like to consult with my enforcement
Yeah, if I
attorneys.
could, because again, if there's an affirmative defense on the one side, but then you're supposed to be exercising the due diligence, and the two have to come together someplace, I think it's pretty important that folks know exactly what that is, because they might think that, well, if I've gone to the website, this is what the EPA says that this company or this RIN's a good one, and I think, okay, even if something goes wrong, I've got an affirmative defense, but then if the question is then for that person or that company, I should say, is what happens with the definition of the due diligence. And,
I understand, and we'll be very clear on that
okay,
in the final.
I'm sorry, I didn't know you were going to ask another question. I was just wanted to.
I'll yield to the gentleman.
And I just want to put from the World Bank in May 2013, this is on this food fuel debate, the World Bank says in the final paragraph, it concludes that most of the price increases are accounted, talking about food prices, are accounted for by crude oil prices, more than 50%, followed by stock-to-use rations and exchange rate movements, which are estimated about 15% each. Crude oil prices mattered most during the recent boom period because they experienced the largest increase. So that was in reference to the food fuel debate and the escalation of prices, mostly on energy costs.
Well, thank you very much, Mr.
Thank you,
Chairman.
Bob.
My time's expired, and I yield back.
Gentlemen, at this time, recognize the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Pompeo, for 5 minutes.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Like Mr. Shimkus, I've got a lot of questions, too. It's no secret to anybody here that I have a deep skepticism of energy subsidies and mandates. This skepticism extends to the RFS as well. I represent Kansas. We've got some of the largest ethanol producers in the world, but we're past the time when parochial interests can set policy for the country. RFS is a bad policy. I think today's testimony bears that out. Folks who are back home are listening to RINs and blend walls and cellulosic mandates and RIN waivers and confiscation of airplanes associated with a market, right? Customers trying to buy gasoline at the pump and fuels to drive their trucks around. I think their head would spin from a set of a Rube Goldberg device like the RFS that we've ended up with. I hope we can move away from that. I suspect we can't undo it just yet, and I hope this hearing will lead us to a thoughtful path forward in how we get out of this mess. Mr. Grunler, you talked about a minute ago in a question, I think it was Mr. Terry's question, you talked about innovation that has resulted from the RFS. I would tell you, I think mostly what's happened is rent seeking. So tell me what innovation the RFS has led to over the, I guess we're between 2005 and 2007 and now.
Thank you for that question, Congressman. The innovation I was referring to was coming up with new ways to make transportation fuel from a whole variety of different feedstocks, from wastes to switchgrass to crop residues, in a way to power America's cars and vehicles.
And in spite of all that information, we're, according to Mr. Szymanski, if I understood it right, about half the way to the $36 billion gallon target. Is that right?
That's correct.
So we've got less than half of the innovation that the members here who voted for this bill a decade ago, almost a decade ago, supposed we might get as a result of this set of mandates. Mr. Grunler, you've got a difficult challenge. You've got to implement not only this RFS, but the CAFE and GHG standards for cars and trucks. The RFS last revised in 2007. We've got new CAFE and GHG rules. Have the CAFE and GHG rules affected compliance with the RFS in a material way?
What they've done is reduce the demand for gasoline in the country, as my colleague Mr. Szymanski has pointed out, and that makes the blending challenge that much harder. So with respect to that, I don't think it's affected it yet, but it has certainly accelerated this blend wall phenomena faster than anyone expected in 2007.
So we've got two sets of rules, and we're now trying to mix too many renewable fuels into too little gasoline. That's the mathematical challenge you face. Is that right?
Essentially.
I've heard from Kansas refiners, they're pretty small refiners, 130,000 barrels a day in some cases. Heard some folks in Pennsylvania have the same problem. They are non-integrated merchant refiners, and there's no relief for them specifically today. What I wanted to know, I guess, Mr. Grunler, do you think you have the authority to grant some sort of relief to these non-merchant, smaller, although not small, by regulation refiners?
They're not eligible for the small refiner provision under the law, as which is the definition is 75,000. So with respect to a particular facility-specific relief, they would not be eligible. No.
So you don't think you have the authority to grant them relief or a waiver in any way under the statute as currently drafted?
I do not.
Thanks. I guess last question, and this is really both to Mr. Grunler and Mr. Glauber. You both referred to the challenge of higher blends, and you, I think Mr. Glauber said you called it a price disruption as impacting how much is blended if we remove the RFS. I guess I don't think of markets creating price disruptions. I think of mandates as creating market disruptions. I'm interested in what a price disruption is when we have willing consumers and willing sellers trying to come to an agreement on price and purchasing.
Yeah, let me clarify. All I'm talking about is price variability, and I'm just saying that when prices move the opposite way, the market will respond, and either by producing or not producing.
Fair enough. And then you've both also referred to the absence of infrastructure, pumps and the like. Isn't that just price too? You talked about liability concerns. Isn't that just a price term as well? Isn't what we really face here? We just have consumers don't want this stuff because they're not willing to pay for it. It's not about, you can build infrastructure, it's just money. You can buy insurance to take your liability risk away. It's just money. Isn't it the case it's just a price issue? And we've got an RFS that's trying to artificially intervene to solve this lack of consumer demand for this product. Would you, either of you agree with that or disagree with it?
Well, there's no doubt that consumers have not demanded high amounts of E85, and it's likely because of the way the product is priced. It's not today priced consistent with its energy content, and I think consumers, some consumers have figured that out.
And I would just say you're right. No one's going to put in infrastructure unless they're going to make those investments themselves, unless they can see recouping.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Dr. Burgess, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Grunwald, let me ask you a question, because I guess back in the summer of 2010, the soon-to-be departed Ed Markey had a briefing where your agency, the EPA and Department of Energy, were brought into this room, and it wasn't a hearing, so there was no official transcript. It was a briefing. But I asked the question of both the EPA and Department of Energy about the testing being done on vehicles, automobiles, to allow the introduction of E15 in a safe manner. And what I got from both the Department of Energy and the Environmental Protection Agency was the other guys doing the testing. Well, that was unsatisfactory. I really had a lot of difficulty actually getting the testing data from either Department of Energy or the EPA. But now you cite this afternoon, in response to, I think, Mr. Barton's question, you cite extensive vehicular testing. Can you give me a figure of the number of vehicles in which this was tested?
I don't want to give you a misleading figure, so I'd like to respond for the record, but my recollection is that the DOE tested on the order of 80, 89, somewhere in that order of magnitude, but I would like to respond for the record specifically, and I'd also like to, if you're interested, provide you with any other technical information or reports as of the result of that testing. I can state with 100% confidence that DOE did have the lead and did conduct this testing.
Right, and that was a testing conducted out at Sandia Labs?
In part, I believe it was in Sandia, but I was not involved at the time, but I can certainly find out.
Well, according to the USA Today from about a year ago, May of 2012, the engine durability study took duplicates of 8 different vehicle models spanning the 2001 to 2009 model years. All 16 vehicles were tested over a 500-hour durability cycle corresponding to about 100,000 miles of vehicle usage. A range of engine operating parameters were monitored during the test, including cylinder compression, valve wear, valve leakage, emissions and emission control, system diagnostics. 2 of the engines tested on E15 had mechanical damage. Another engine showed increased tailpipe emissions beyond the allowable limit. So that's 3 out of the 8 in this admittedly limited, but I'm given to understand, I mean, this is the study upon which the agencies are relying to provide us with this information. Now, the question comes up for the retailer, for the mom and pop store, the 7-Eleven that's selling gasoline, what limit of liability do they have if someone doesn't read the fine print on the little stick-on label that's going to be affixed to the tank that don't put this in your car if your vehicle model is earlier than 2001? What limit of liability does the retailer have in that situation?
Congressman, I'd like to respond to for the record with respect to the liability question, because I don't feel I'm qualified to answer that aspect of the question. I do want to clarify that with respect to the testing that you referenced, that's only part of the information that the agency relied on to make its determination, and I'd like to respond more fully for the record to describe you the bulk of the work that DOE conducted, as well as the other studies that EPA looked at with respect to E15 and its impacts on emission control systems.
Well, you know, I just have to tell you, I mean, I've got a radio show car guy on Saturday mornings back in the Dallas-Fort Worth market, Ed Wallace, and he's written about this extensively in his own column in the Fort Worth Star-Telegram and Business Week. And I just want to quote from an article that he wrote in Business Week in 2010. The older cars owned by those less financially secure will likely be the first to go. In fact, that's already happened in thousands of cases nationwide. He's talking about the introduction of E15 into these vehicles. Maybe when it starts happening to some of those on more solid financial ground, then someone will listen. Adding an expensive, harmful, useless filler to gasoline is not remotely the same thing as having a legitimate national energy policy. Mr. Chairman, I thank you for the recognition.
Would the Chairman yield for just 10 seconds?
I will yield for 14 seconds.
Just a point, there is legislation that I've introduced on liability protection, both for the retailer and for the refiner, on selling an approved fuel.
Reclaiming my time, I will also mention that I have introduced legislation that would actually take us back to the pre-2007 days when the inadvised increase in the ethanol mandate was passed by the House in 2007 and signed by President Bush that year. It's H.R. 1469 if members want to take a look at the legislation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Olson, for 5 minutes.
I thank the chair and welcome to our witnesses. This here clearly is a very passionate issue that crosses party lines. But we owe the American people a thorough review of the RFS for one simple reason. The American energy outlook that drove the creation of ethanol tax, subsidies, and RFS is in the dustbin of history. Tax preferences for corn-based ethanol were created last century and mutated into RFS this century. Why this flurry of government activity? Because we thought we hit peak gas, meaning that to feed our ever-growing demand for gasoline, we had to buy more and more oil from foreign sources that were unreliable. Our production was going down every single day. But the American innovator, with new technology, has pushed peak oil back to the next century. And while I think the best solution to this problem is to repeal RFS, my mind is not closed. But it's not empty either. Mr. Szymanski, it seems to me that the only way that RFS could be viable in the years ahead without any modifications would be if market conditions dramatically changed. And following former Chairman Dingell's lead, I'll ask you to answer yes or no. Yes or no, does EIA expect a dramatic spike in gasoline demand over the next few years?
Does EIA expect what?
A dramatic spike in
No,
gasoline
sir, we do
prices.
not.
Absolutely not. Yes or no, does EIA expect a spike in the use of either E15 or E85? Spike E15, E85, next couple of years.
In production volumes?
Production volume, use in automobiles, transportation.
We're seeing a lot of difficulty in producing those fuels.
So I think that's a no, no spike there. Yes or no, does EIA expect sudden, widespread production of advanced biofuels in the next few years?
Not without a technological breakthrough.
There we go. So in your opinion, these facts bode well for compliance with the RFS as it stands today?
As my testimony said, the RFS as it's currently constituted simply can't be met.
Okay, so my next question for you, sir, if it doesn't match the standards, if all those answers were no, can RFS be saved? Or is it easier to end it and start over, making a product, a policy that reflects the new U.S. energy reality? Think so? Good idea? Yea or nay?
That's a policy issue.
Okay, I appreciate that. And my next question is for Dr. Glauber. Sir, in your opening remarks, you touched on how corn-based ethanol has increased the price of commodities. Conclusions vary, but you cited several studies discussing ethanol contributing to over 30% of the increase in corn prices. And I have a copy of a USDA research piece that was put out earlier this year by Dr. Richard Volpe, PhD from the Food Markets Branch. And the first panel is the outlook for 2013. And I quote, "But high-priced corn, soybeans, and wheat will permeate supermarkets. Structural inflation for beef, pork will intensify. Overall, inflation higher than the historical average." Next slide. What does this mean for consumers? Food prices increase. I heard from a Wendy's restaurants last week, and they said very publicly that their average retail location lost nearly $30,000 per store last year because of commodity price increases. Restaurants have a tight profit margin. That's money that doesn't go towards expansions and doesn't go towards a new employee. Briefly, What are the ways in which commodity prices increases have negatively impacted non-farm businesses?
Well, Congressman, understand last year most of this was due to the fact that we had a very extreme drought in the Midwest that sharply reduced corn and soybean yields and pushing those crop prices up substantially. I think what's the surprising thing, that piece was written a while back. I think the surprising thing is the fact that thus far we haven't seen much increase in the overall retail price of food. Now, I'm not, this isn't saying that Wendy's or other businesses that you've talked about haven't faced higher costs. I understand that. But at least as measured by BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics, just the most recent report said prices for food at home were about 0.8% higher than they were at this time last year. Now, to understand how inflation works when you see higher corn prices, it doesn't make itself known right away. You don't, and that's largely because one of the major uses for corn is for cattle feed and for livestock feed. So that takes time. You see shorter, smaller margins, and some producers liquidate herds. That drives up the price of livestock products, which then shows up in retail foods. That effect is much, much, much smaller than the overall effect on commodities. So corn prices can go up a lot, retail prices, and it's large go up much, much smaller percent. And that's largely because the farm gate price in a retail food dollar is only about 14% or so. You have transformation of it, you have distribution. But it is an impact on inflation. When ERS just put out new numbers, the Economic Research Service, of which you were quoting from there, they just put out new numbers. Yesterday, they're talking about food inflation being on the average of 2.5% to 3.5% this year, which is certainly higher than it was last year, but in line more or less with where we've been over the last 10 years. It's not denying that these things have inflationary pressure, because they do. But understand, again, the main part was because of the drought that we saw.
Gentleman's time has expired. This time I recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Griffith, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Gunner, let me ask you this question, and here's the concern. Our retail gas folks, and you've heard the questions earlier, and I'm not going to go back through the history about E15, and we heard about the question on, legal liability for the person if they put the wrong fuel into the engine for a car that's pre-2001. Of course, I'm driving a 2003, and I don't know whether that'll impact them a little bit or not, but for these older cars, we've heard about that, and you're going to get us an answer, and I appreciate that. But one of the concerns that a lot of the folks who sell the gas, the convenience stores and the gas stations, is quite frankly, they're also concerned that, if they decide that they're going to sell the E15 alongside E10, what happens, what is the risk to them that your agency will hit them with a violation of the Clean Air Act? And there's some concern, they gave me some history on it, because apparently when they were switching from, unleaded fuel to leaded fuel, if the gas station owner didn't go out and physically say, no, you can't buy, that's the wrong car for that unleaded gas or for that leaded gas, they got fined, and it appears the fines can be assessed for up to $37,500. So what I'm asking you is that there have been some indications that certainly your agency wouldn't go in that direction, but we have nothing in writing to assure these folks. I'm asking you, can you get us something in writing that will assure the convenience store operators, the gas station operators, that if they're trying to do what's right, they're not going to be fined when a consumer comes up and puts the wrong kind of gas into the vehicle?
Just to clarify, sir, they're not going to be. The question is, will they be fined by
for CAA
government
by the government?
If a consumer ignores the label and
that's the question,
their
yes,
vehicle?
sir.
I'd be happy to take that back and talk to my counsel and see what our response would be.
Well, it would seem to me that, we've heard testimony that it's going to be difficult to get the E15, that it's going to be difficult to use, that there are going to be some problems. We've got a question about legal liability. It would seem to me at the very least that's something that the government ought to be able to do, is to reassure these folks that on top of all the other headaches in trying to move forward with this program, that they don't have to worry about the government coming in and hitting them with a pretty hefty fine. Because if you're a small retailer, not a big chain. Maybe the big chains can handle it, but the small retailer, that's a lot of money. Particularly in a district like mine where the average household income is only $36,000 a year. That's, you know, annual salary for somebody.
I understand. And in fact, this issue was just brought to my attention yesterday by the head of the association of these kinds of businesses.
Sure.
So we're listening very carefully, and if there are any kind of barriers that EPA is putting in the way, we'd like to address those.
I appreciate that. Dr. Glauber, you've talked a little bit about the fuel cost, the corn costs going up affecting the cost of food, but don't we also have a situation where it affects those livestock dealers? And I think you just mentioned that some of them are liquidating their herds, and isn't it maybe the unintentional consequence that we've helped the row farmers, but we've hurt all these other farmers? And it's certainly not the intent of the government to hurt the livestock, poultry, and dairy farmers, is it?
Well, it's certainly the case that if you look from 2005 to current, that profits in those industries have declined. And it's no mystery, it's due to higher feed costs. It's been exacerbated, and particularly over the last year, exacerbated by the drought, which not only shot up feed prices, but also reduced pasture conditions in most of the U.S.
And wouldn't we expect at some point on the food inflation, I mean, not only because the feed costs went up, but because the liquidation of some of those herds, that at some point there may be pressure upward on the price of beef particularly?
Well, again, that is how inflation typically occurs in those industries. I would just point out that one thing.
Be quick because I'm running out of time. I got another question. That's okay. I'll get the rest of it from you at a later time because it is important that
I apologize.
That's all right. No. Look, we're trying to get some information here, and the problem is these industries I think should factor in on a decision when you're hurting these industries on waivers. But last year I was one of the congressmen that wrote a letter asking for a waiver, and this is coming back to you, Mr. Gundler. The governor of Virginia asked for a waiver trying to help our farmers out. Do you need new legislation because the waiver wasn't granted at a time when I think it probably screamed to be granted? Do you need new legislation, or do you think that the EPA can actually look at these waivers in an unbiased manner and grant some of these waivers when, like last year, we had a drought? It's affecting the farmers in my district, and I have an agriculture on coal district. There's two of my big industries, and we're under attack on coal. Now it seems like agriculture is not getting any help when it needs it. Isn't there some waiver process, or do you need me to put it in a bill?
Well, of course, it's completely up to Congress in terms of how you'd like the EPA to administer these authorities. You gave us a pretty stringent test, which was severe economic harm, and that the RFS is responsible for that. Again, based on all the information and the objective analysis we did in response to the governor of Virginia's request, we determined that the demand for ethanol is such that waiving the RFS would not have influenced that demand, would not have influenced feed prices, would not have influenced corn prices at all.
I would just say that my farmers in my district, I can't speak to the rest of the country, disagree, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman's time has expired. Now, this time I recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. And I first want to say that there's been a lot said, both good and bad, obviously, regarding the renewable fuel standard. And the most important information, I think, to remember is that the RFS reduces our dependence on foreign oil and reduces our carbon emissions. And we'll have to see whether or not it'll be a success or a failure. But I think there are things we can do now to help strengthen the RFS, decrease our reliance on foreign oil, and improve our national security. For many years, and I just recently introduced the bill for this Congress, I call it the Open Fuel Standard Act, which I believe is a complement to the RFS. I introduced it in a bipartisan way, as I always have, with Congresswoman Ileana Ross-Lehtinen as my co-sponsor. And what the legislation essentially does is it requires auto manufacturers to build cars that can run on alternative fuels in addition to gasoline. Mr. Shimkus and I have, in previous Congresses, teamed together to push this. This could include ethanol, methanol, natural gas, electricity, biodiesel, hydrogen, or a new technology. It would empower consumers to make a choice about which fuel is best for them, and I hope that we would take up this legislation. Got the idea for it many years ago when I was chair of the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee on the Foreign Affairs Committee, and drove into a gasoline station in Brazil and saw that there were many blends, many mixes, many choices that consumers had. And since I believe that choice helps keep costs down, it seemed to me that it was foolish for us not to do it in this country. And when I learned more in those years about what it would cost to manufacture flex fuel cars in America, no one told me that it would ever be more than $100 per car to manufacture them. In fact, some people said it was as low as, some experts said it was as low as $35 a car. The most anyone told me was $100. And so for such a little amount of money, it seemed to me almost criminal that we weren't doing it. So let me ask Mr. Grundler, one of the major concerns with the RFS is the so-called blend wall. And can you comment on how adoption of My Open Fuels Act and the adoption of more flex fuel vehicles might affect the blend wall?
That's hard to answer, sir. Currently, as has been stated, I think there's somewhere between 10 and 12 million flex fuel vehicles on the road right now. But it appears, based on the evidence, that consumers are not using them to buy E85. I think roughly 100 million gallons of E85 was sold last year. Perhaps Mr. Szymanski's got a better number, and it's likely that's due to a number of factors. And some owners don't know they've got a flex fuel vehicle. Some owners have these flex fuel vehicles, but they may live in Texas, where I learned earlier that there might be one station selling E85. And some are discouraged by the price of E85. So your question, well, if there were more flex fuel vehicles available, would that change this pricing dynamic? And I don't know if it would. Today, I think Ford is roughly making 40% of their vehicles as flex fuel. General Motors is 40, maybe slightly above. Chrysler is making a significant percentage. So they're on track to meet their commitment of 50% of production. And yet the evidence to date shows that consumers have not been choosing to use the higher blend ethanols. Now, that condition may change if the pricing structure for E85 changes, but that remains to be seen.
Yeah, I believe that it would increase consumer demand, but I do agree with your, your thinking that a lot of people right now are not aware of it. It's not something that we promote or we push, and if people don't see it's going to bring them any kind of benefit at the pump, everyone likes to think they care about the environment, but they care more about their pockets. I think that's part of it. Let me ask the Administrator Szymanski, would you agree? What would be your opinion? Do you think that adoption of the Open Fuel Act would increase consumer demand for ethanol and other alternative fuels?
I have to ask our people to take a look at it. I think the market itself is driving some alternative fuels. I just heard today from Ford that there's a very high demand. They can't even meet the demand for heavy pickup trucks that use compressed natural gas, for example. So I think that there is some consumer demand out there for these fuels. And as Mr. Grundler said, a lot of it has to do with consumer behavior and what the price of the fuels is. If we had either through a regulatory system or through the market itself lower prices for these advanced fuels, then I think that there would be a lot less consumer resistance.
Well, let me say, I see my time is up, but I just want to say I believe with all my heart that if it works in Brazil, it can work here if we wish it to work. Yeah. But I thank you both for your comments. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Now, some of you in the audience may have noticed that these two gentlemen on the left, Mr. Welch and Mr. Matheson, have been here the entire hearing. And some of you, when I stopped rotating, looked quizzically at me, and I want you to know I have great admiration and respect for both these gentlemen, and I'm not discriminating against them, but we have a rule in the Energy and Commerce Committee that if you're not a member of the subcommittee, you have to wait till every member of the subcommittee has asked a question. So while they are a member of other subcommittees on the Energy and Commerce, and they're valuable members of the Energy and Commerce, that's why we waited for that. So I didn't want you all to boo and hiss me when I left this afternoon. But I'm delighted to, but I'm delighted to recognize them now, and I recognize Mr. Matheson for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I would not boo or hiss you, I can tell you that. And I appreciate the witnesses being here today. I have a lot of questions. I assume maybe if we can't get them all in, we can ask for written questions after. That'd be great. Dr. Glauber, you've talked in response to a few different questioners about RFS, the RFS impact on increasing corn prices, and how that translated into the broader issue of raising food prices. You mentioned that the drought may have been a more significant factor in that one particular year. Has the Department of Agriculture really tried to analyze this where they normalized that 1 year where there was the severe drought? I mean, this is something that's been around for a long time. We're increasing the cost of corn over time. It's been going up. In your testimony, you mentioned that. I just think it'd be helpful for this committee to understand what the impact is on food, or if the department's had a chance to analyze that, with taking out the factor of the significant drought impact.
Yes, and it's a great question and an obvious one. We did actually look at this back in 2008, I believe. I testified before an energy committee over in the Senate. And there, if I remember correctly, and I'd have to pull it, and I can get this to you in writing and get the study to you. But there, the impact on corn, again, in the order of 30 or so % impact on soybeans, in the order of 40, 45%, as high as that. And how that translated in terms of percentage impact on retail food prices was actually pretty small, like in the order of a percentage point increase on CPI. I'd have to, again, I want to be very careful here and
no, I
go back to
understand.
the
It
actual
might be
thing.
interesting.
But again, the point is the transmission's a little bit much smaller than.
I got you. It'd be interesting to see how things are going forward too.
Yeah.
That was 2008. That'd be interesting.
Yeah, happy to answer that.
Mr. Grundler, we talked earlier in response to an earlier question, somebody's talking about the carbon emission benefits of advanced biofuels. Can you speak briefly to the carbon emissions from corn-based ethanol on a life cycle basis?
I'd be happy to. As you probably know, Congress, in developing the RFS, came up with kind of basically two different categories of fuels and chose to grandfather any facility that hadn't commenced construction at the time of passage. So corn-based ethanol, most of that volume is in fact grandfathered, and so it is not required by law to meet the 20% greenhouse gas reduction threshold. Now we know over time that there are a number of economic incentives to improve the efficiency of your operation, to look for cheaper crops, seek higher yield feedstocks. So we expect that efficiency will improve. And in fact, in our analysis of new plants and future plants out in 2022, when we did the impact analysis, did determine that those new plants would achieve the 20% reduction.
But the current plants, because they're grandfathered, are not.
Well, it depends. It's going to be a plant-specific thing. For example, those plants that may have switched from coal to natural gas would be more efficient.
Let me ask you, you've had a few questions also from folks about how you undertook the testing for impact on automobiles from going to E15. And you may have answered this, but I just want to clarify this. Did it just focus on emission controls, or did the testing include specific tests to evaluate engine and fuel system durability?
There's been a lot of confusion on that, sir, and I would be happy to give you the details, but the answer is that the Department of Energy looked at both.
Okay.
And in fact did tear down a number of vehicles and did a number of different types of testing to evaluate not just the emission control catalyst durability question, but also these other questions.
Okay, so you'll submit that for the record.
Be delighted
Great.
to.
Mr. Smitsky, I wanted to ask you a question about RINs. Before 2013, they were selling for just a few cents. At the beginning of this year, we've seen the price skyrocket. It was over $1 at one point. I hear right now it's in the 80 to 90 cent range for a RIN. What caused the huge jump in RIN prices, And will rising RIN prices, what's its impact on the price of gasoline for consumers?
I think we heard earlier from Mr. Glauber that the RIN price increases probably had a lot, the increases in the first quarter this year had an awful lot to do with the uncertainties in meeting the program targets. So RINs would be very valuable if you thought you weren't going to be able to produce the right amount of fuel. As far as we can tell, and we've tried to look at this at EIA, we can't really see a big impact in the price of gasoline from what happened with RINs in the first quarter this year. I do think that there might have been some impact in the diesel prices because of the way the program works. Going forward, if there aren't changes in the program, we would expect it to begin to impact gasoline prices.
Have you projected where you think RIN prices are going to be in the next couple of years? Have you projected
We
that?
haven't, because it's extremely difficult to do that without understanding what decisions ultimately are going to be made by the EPA.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, my time's expired. I'll submit other questions for the record. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, and Mr. Welch, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate being here, and I've enjoyed the hearing, and I want to thank the witnesses for all the work that you do on behalf of our country. I sat through this hearing because I have come to the conclusion that corn ethanol is bad for it's a bad environmental policy, bad energy policy, bad food policy. And that's largely because of two things that I've been hearing over and over again from everyday Vermonters. First, farmers who've just been hammered with the increase in the feed cost that is associated in part with the corn-based ethanol. And then secondly, a lot of the small engine repair people are absolutely convinced that the ethanol is detrimental to these engines. And if I didn't believe it, my own chainsaw got wrecked, and I'm pretty upset about it, let me tell you. So this is serious business for our farmers and for our recreation industry, a lot of anybody using a small engine. And Congress did it, so you're implementing it, but I just do have a few questions about it. One is, if we did provide a safety valve, and last year when we had that the worst drought in 50 years, more than 70% of the cattle country was impacted. 10 governors, 156 members of Congress, including me, in a broad coalition of farm and food groups, requested an EPA waiver, and that was denied. That was on the RFS. That was denied. But in denying the waiver, the EPA appears to have created a stricter standard than Congress had. At least that's how I read it, rejecting harm to states or regions, and instead determining that the agency needed to show that RFS implementation would severely harm the entire U.S. economy. So I need some clarification on that, because the spike in feed prices certainly hurt us. It hurt every agricultural activity associated with livestock. So I'm wondering what it would take from the perspective of where you sit for a waiver to have a valid factual basis for you to act. And maybe I think I'll address that to Mr. Grundler. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. There's no doubt that the drought had devastating effects, and where I'm from in the Midwest, I've seen it. Again, but the question before the agency was implementing the RFS responsible for these severe economic conditions? And we determined, after extensive analysis and consultation and using a probabilistic, stochastic modeling framework to look at all these different variables in terms of corn yields and oil prices, that the RFS itself wasn't driving this demand, and it's because of the way our refining system.
Well, wait. So does that mean that if you have the RFS standard requires more corn, obviously, to be going into the ethanol production, and that means less corn going into the feed, and you have a drought, So the two probably work together. I don't know how you can precisely attribute how much of it is to the RFS and how much of it is to the drought, but obviously RFS becomes more difficult when there is a drought impact. So you're saying...
Well, we ask ourselves the question, if we waived the RFS, what would be the ethanol demand in the country, which was, again, the ethanol demand, which is getting the corn and changing the commodity markets. And the answer was in 89% of the scenarios that we ran is that it would not change that demand. But refiners are demanding this ethanol for the reasons Mr. Szymanski mentioned. It's because they want the octane. It has economic value because it's cheap, cheaper than the other alternatives. And so we could have waived the whole RFS, and they would still have demanded that product.
Well,
in
it's kind of a
2012,
good news,
so
bad news. I'm sorry, go ahead.
So it is a case-by-case situation. So in 2012, and looking at that year, and looking at the price of oil and corn yields and all the other variables, that was the determination that we made. But that doesn't mean that if we were looking at this situation this year or next year with different market conditions, that different result.
My time's almost up. Thank you. But you know, it sort of reinforces my concern about this demand that's created for corn for ethanol, as opposed to food, because as many of my colleagues have pointed out, both sides of the aisle, it's having a real impact on food prices, and certainly really wicked on these dairy farmers that are hanging on by their fingernails. But thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really appreciate you having this hearing. I think both sides of the aisle here share some concerns about this policy. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Welch, and I want to thank the witnesses. We appreciate your being with us, and I hope that everyone in the audience enjoyed it as much as we did, and we intend to have a couple more hearings on this as well. So that will conclude today's hearing. We'll keep the record open for 10 days, and we look forward to working with all of you as we move forward. With that, the hearing is dismissed, adjourned.
Get back to the beach. Glad that you were here.
I really enjoyed working.